This is an interesting one. It's all about empires, and this is from Uncivilized, called How Empires Fall and Why the US is Next. Damning title, that's for sure, because a lot of the repercussions around the world will be felt, I guess, with any empire falling, but hey. I have my opinions on this, but I haven't watched this video, so let's see what they have to say.
Every empire falls. That is certain, no matter how long they reigned and how far their rule stretched. From the Romans, who ruled for over one...
This is where my family is from, Sardinia. Beautiful island. If you've never been, go there.
1,000 years, to the Ottomans, who spanned continents, and the USSR that changed the political landscape of the modern world. So is the empire we're living under today also crumbling?
Yes. The key question is how fast.
We have bounties beyond those known to the people of any other day.
American democracy is obviously limping on both feet.
America is not the greatest country in the world anymore.
Same shot.
The US empire is falling, and there are 3 symptoms of its impending demise that we can see from looking to the past. Let's start with the oldest of the bunch.
All right, this is going to be good. One quick note. Obviously, every empire falls, right? But it's to which degree does it fall? How far does it fall? How impacted is everyone by it? And how long does it take? As in, do we even need to worry? At the moment, it feels like we do, considering the standard of life is dropping over time in the West versus other places where the standard of life, even though it's still worse than the US, is actually increasing. And that change between hope in one country versus despair in another is very important, because they can really snowball into a major decline.
These videos are made possible by our supporters on Patreon.
Yeah.
If you'd like to help us tell more stories like this,
join.
you can become a paying member through the link in the description. Now back to the video. The Roman Empire oversaw...
He did the Elon Musk there, did you see?
Description.
Look at that.
Now back to the video. The Roman Empire oversaw the lives of millions of people. Remnants of its great reign still stand in cities across the world, a testament to their reach and influence in the lands they conquered.
Never has Rome been greater or stronger than now.
But then, after 1,000 years of domination, it fell. And just like Rome wasn't built in a day, it didn't fall in one either. Instead, the fall of the Roman Empire was death by 1,000 cuts. But there's one factor in particular we're going to look at: internal decay.
At the height of its grandeur and its glory, a civilization so powerful it could never be conquered from without. Yet it found the seeds of its destruction within itself.
There was a huge disparity between the lives of the elite and the commoners. Rome's elites lived in grand estates, hosting lavish, decadent banquets where they'd feast on peacock tongue and wine from naked waiters.
Every one of these senatorial families has holdings all over the Roman Empire. They're the equivalent of small multinational corporations. They are wealthy in a way that is impossible for us to understand.
It's like oligarchy today in the US.
The poor lived a very different reality. They worked menial jobs and lived mostly on bread and porridge, living in overcrowded, badly built buildings, prone to collapse and spreading disease.
The games are all about the Roman emperors giving the people what...
On a side note, talking about dilapidated buildings, at the moment the US is building incredibly shoddy buildings. They are so bad. They just have a great facade on them, great. So they look quite up to standard, or they look quite good. But there's even a building inspector that keeps getting hunted because he shares all the destruction in some of these houses when they're being built, like $1 million houses with problems. His name is Cy Porter, if you ever want to follow him.
They need, and it's always described as bread and circuses. They had to feed the people of Rome, but once they were fed, they had to be entertained.
Let the games begin!
I guess I'm just trying to find similarities to what I'm watching here versus what's happening in the US. And in the end, it's all monetary, right? If you have crappy buildings, why is that the case? Can people not afford better buildings? I mean, that's obviously the answer, right? Or is it? I could be wrong. I'm not going to pretend like I know a whole lot about all the intricacies. We're talking about an entire empire where there are all the moving parts. No one's going to know everything, right?
There were
watch.
famines, peasant uprisings, and slavery, and the Roman tax system disproportionately impacted the lower classes, while the wealthy often avoided taxes through exemption or corruption.
This is now a new era of Roman history. Rome is no longer what it was. Rome is in decline.
The middle class was shrinking, and the economy became increasingly polarized between the very rich and the very poor, all fueling resentment and instability. So what does this tell us about the US?
Home they've always dreamed of, the happiest investment they have ever made.
The middle class was once a symbol of the American dream. It meant owning your own home with a white picket fence, a car, kids going to school, a perceived ease and quality of life that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world, and that anyone could achieve so long as they worked hard enough.
We are a prospering people, wherever we live or earn our livelihood.
But for the past few decades, that's all become increasingly out of reach for lots of Americans.
Some people skipping meals because they simply can't afford it.
The number of people experiencing homelessness in a single...
This is the thing, right? We seem to glance over it all the time, but this type of stuff is not reminiscent of a first world country. It just isn't. You gotta face it for what it is, right?
Night went up 12%.
Every year, hundreds of thousands of people are literally asking for donations to afford medical treatment.
Our roads and bridges are crumbling, our airports are out of date, and the vast majority of our seaports are in danger of becoming obsolete.
But Americans from the grocery store to the gas station are seeing their budgets tighten every single month.
And the changes suggested would mean higher taxes for the average American family, widening America's already massive income gap.
90% of the wealth is right here in the top. And then the lower middle class, they've got 0.3% of a piece. Yeah, they have some crumbs there. And the poorest, they have no pie. In fact, they have less.
They really gotta do us like this? This demonstration is evil.
Than no pie. They actually have a bill for pie. They're in pie debt.
They're struggling to meet rent or mortgage payments, repay college loans, to repay loans for a car.
While the wealthy have become steadily wealthier, wages have been stagnant and costs of living have surged. And it's not like these changes are mutually exclusive. It's off the backs of workers, off the exploitation of the American masses, that the wealthy continue to engorge themselves.
Elon Musk has officially become the richest person in the world. His net worth has crossed the $400 billion US mark.
Companies buying out the housing market, insurance companies making healthcare unaffordable, politicians taking money from lobbies to protect corporate interests and fill their own pockets, and the working class is well aware.
Hoarding wealth is so harmful, so unethical, so rage-inducing.
Billionaires should not exist. So you talk about teacher's salary, $2,000 in rent, $400 car payment, you got insurance, you got groceries, electricity. Like, I don't understand how people are affording.
Yeah, so she's making a good point, right? I don't know about all the other ones. Some of them are just ranting without any form of backing statistically. Whatever. That's not the point. The point is that people just can't afford to live the life that existed 20 years ago. But not even that. If it were still okay, that's fine. But some are, in that other video, they're like $1,000 away from financial bankruptcy. They can't even afford that. And then how are you supposed to live a stress-free life when you know any day now your life could be in shambles? It's just not, it's not sustainable.
Affording life right now.
For 5 stitches, $3,800.
What?
That's
like,
crazy.
it's so freaking hard to live here.
North America is one big scam.
And then there's the internal social and political decay. People have become disenchanted with the illusion of American democracy, of its promises of equality, of equal opportunity for all as long as you pick yourself up by your bootstraps.
You can see a sea of people all united under one cause. They are protesting for racial equality.
The murder of a healthcare executive has led to online
Free Luigi, you know? And the thing is it really truly an American democracy at all anymore? That's the question. Does it feel like that? I don't know. There was,
popularity for the shooter.
Mangione has emerged in some circles as a sympathetic figure fighting the system.
All this leads to political instability.
I remember when he did what he did, I remember speaking to someone, it was, in this case, a boomer, right? And they said, you know, they understand that there's hatred against health insurance companies, but it's not the way to go by killing someone. And I had to really consider this one. It's like, okay, I can understand that viewpoint, but if a company, a health insurance company, is declining, I think it was 80%, they'll just do an initial decline, and most people will never fight it because it's too much work to try to argue this point. And by the time everything has been resolved, you're probably already way down the line of your illness where it's even worse. Then you have to ask, how many people has that CEO killed with those practices? It's not direct killing, no, but it's complete malpractice. It's complete fraud in some sense to do it this way. And you always wonder, if everything is going so terribly, what do we really need to do to change it if a form of democracy isn't working? You know, you can speak of things like anarchy and everything, which is not, like, we really don't want to have to go down a road like that. But do you just fade away into apathy until people don't even care anymore? Where this is like post-starvation, post some of the worst conditions you could ever imagine. But once the hope is gone and you just don't care anymore, you don't believe in it, which is kind of happening in the youth, then whatever is ruling the country versus the people in it are just two separate parallel universes. They're not even in the same place. One is speaking of we need to build, we need to hope, and all these keywords in politics, and the other one is just trying to get by. Again, don't forget, the US is still in a strong position for its citizens. You still can make it here if you choose to move state or whatever, but the direction is worrying. Let me put it that way. And there are places that are very difficult to live in, and that just shouldn't be the case. I don't know. Are you in the US? How's it for you?
Instability, economic trouble, and social unrest, which weakens the empire at its core. But an empire is bigger than its center. It's a network of vassal states serving the core's interests, and keeping all those entities in check is done through both soft power and hard power.
Oh, did you feel that?
That brings us to symptom number 2. To understand soft power and how it plays into imperial decline, let's look at the Ottomans.
It was a huge empire, dominated by a Turkish dynasty that had its origins in Asia Minor.
The Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful and enduring empires in history, spanning 3 continents at its height. It was a hub of cultural and scientific innovation, producing advancements in medicine, astronomy, architecture, and engineering that changed the world.
They ruled a considerable mix of peoples and faiths.
There was no great history of ethnic tension, even though there was a history of massively complicated ethnic and confessional coexistence.
Not long ago, the Ottoman Empire
It lasted almost 600 years, until it didn't. One factor that contributed to its demise was its waning influence over the peoples and territories it had under its control, also known as the loss of soft power. Soft power is about being more persuasive than coercive, about getting people to comply without using force. In the case of the Ottomans, it was a delicate balance of diplomacy and cultural influence. But over time, the empire's ability to foster loyalty among diverse groups was eroding, aided by rising nationalism within these communities.
The Greeks were the first to rebel against the Ottoman shackles.
The minute you start getting a political world, this system is going to break down. And that is what happens in the 19th century, and that is the great conundrum for the empire.
People stopped buying into the vision of the empire and began to break off and pursue their own interests.
Makes sense?
Now, the US has been really good at soft power. It began after World War II, when the US positioned itself as a global leader promoting democracy, economic growth, and cultural influence.
Joe's the king because he can buy more with his wages than any other worker on the globe.
It is the most important idea that the United
It's funny seeing that ad. That's always been the rhetoric since before until this day. America number one, right? America number one.
The United States has contributed to the world. Citizens of every rank can expect to have a better, richer, happier life.
It helped rebuild war-torn Europe, set up major global institutions where it continues to hold significant power, and has exported music, television, and pop culture across the world for decades.
Absolutely.
And the messaging of this soft power has been consistent and clear.
Shining city upon a hill. After 200 years, she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom.
But for soft power to work, for people to buy into the fantasy and want to participate, they need to see credibility and moral consistency. Now, just to be clear, the US has violated the principles it preaches since its founding, not to mention since its emergence as a global hegemon. It seems the majority of people were willing to overlook that and buy into the American dream.
I grew up in '91, and the presence of US media where I was living in Denmark was, and I don't know about, it's not the same today, it was very large. And we all had this idea that the US seemed in a certain way. It's all, I mean, in some way, it's just media, right? But it was very strong, I'll just give you that, compared to what she's saying.
But the illusion is falling apart.
There you go, that's exactly. So today, a lot of Europeans look down upon the United States. So from personal experience, that's 100% true.
Mob tore down scaffolding, battled their way through the last line of police defense, and broke into the Capitol building itself.
At home, the land of democracy, liberty, and human rights hasn't kept up the best image in recent years. And it's not any better abroad. The US has spearheaded and overseen devastating wars, crippling debt, human rights violations, and environmental damage across the world, which has made it hard to take preaching of democracy and freedom seriously.
America no longer...
Wasn't it Putin that said that the US is responsible for most terrorism around the world? It was, yeah, correct me if I'm getting it wrong.
Charts a course and therefore has lost all rights to set it, and even more so to impose it on others.
Disillusionment with American values is growing, and in its panic, the empire continues to thrash and bully to stay relevant. That's where I have a theory. I apologize for pausing all the time, but this is a good one. I think the United States, in terms of its age, is still a teenager or young adult. If you look at it in terms of age, and I think many countries in Europe are older, like wherever you want to put it, grandfather age in some sense, and they're not as interested in bullying. They just want to, they're a bit more conservative, they're a bit more stuck in their ways, which is true for a lot of Europe. And the US is still trying to push itself around the world, trying to form its identity. But the problem with bullying is that eventually it just doesn't work forever, right? And people start finding a way around you because they don't want to be subjected to this constant attack from a place. It doesn't mean physical attack, but what you get my point. And that's how I see the US. I think it's still growing out of its infancy, that's the wrong word, out of its teenager times in some sense. And that's why it behaves in the way it does. And whatever comes next after all of this is unknown, of course. And if it needs a moment to realize itself, it's like anyone that gets into 25 or 25 years old, whatever, needs to realize that, hey, everything I believed in my teenager years, now I'm actually living reality. It's different. I just obviously hope the best for US Americans living here, just trying to live an average life. Hope they don't get pulled too much around with all of this transition, because it's a very chaotic time. Power comes in.
Do you like my analogy, or is it terrible?
And brings us to the third symptom of the fall of an empire. This one is best illustrated by the Soviet Union.
Let's go. Bully up.
Now, the USSR ideologically rejected the idea of imperialism, but the reality is that it looked and acted like an empire.
The Soviet Communist Party has not faced a serious internal threat to its political rule since the 1920s.
There was a centralized authority overseeing expansion and control of a collection of republics and satellite states, where movements for autonomy were suppressed. What tethered these states together was a unified ideology, communism. But it was also hard power, military might. And that costs money.
It is here, in Red Square, that the superpower Soviet Union holds its military parades, displaying its might for all the world to see.
At its strongest, the Soviet Union had 5 million soldiers stationed around the Union and pursued wars and conquests to maintain and expand its reach. Then there's all the money spent on the arms race during the Cold War. Money spent on propping up parties in proxy wars across the world, and money spent on wars like Afghanistan, a protracted 10-year-long conflict that cost them $50 billion.
The superpower from the
just no one wins Afghanistan. Everyone keeps trying. They just never win.
North occupies Afghanistan with more than 100,000 troops, a modern mechanized army.
Eventually, the cost of keeping the empire in check became unmanageable, and the economy took a hit. By the late 80s, people within the Union were struggling with soaring poverty and a low
What's up with the Italian music?
quality of life, with no strategic wins to show for all that money spent. Military and ideological overextension drained not only the economy, but public morale as well, until people got fed up.
Okay.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time.
Crazy.
Sounds familiar.
All estimates agree that the cost will be at least $1 trillion. The Bush administration never expected the war to drag on as long as it has.
The fall of Kabul to the Taliban marked an abrupt end to America's longest war. The war cost American taxpayers about $1 trillion.
The US carried out long, brutal, expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with nothing to show for it except instability and devastation and financial loss. Then there's the constant ideological wars. The war on communism, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on China and Russia. There's a constant boogeyman in the ether to justify US military spending. The US maintains the most bases in the world at over 700 and spends hundreds of billions of dollars on the military every year, more than the next 10 countries combined. It's funding Ukraine in its war against Russia. It might support Taiwan in a war against China. Billions of dollars spent.
They missed the whole part about Israel, but you know, whatever.
And we can't remember the last war the US has actually won.
That's crazy.
But last year, an undeniable awakening happened.
Okay.
This has been a senseless and a deliberate slaughter, a genocide, and it is happening on our dime.
For over a year, Americans and the rest of the world have watched US politicians from both sides of the aisle cheer on and fund the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza to the tune of billions of dollars. It has shattered the idea that the US is a beacon of justice and human rights and irreversibly cemented the hypocrisy of American moral exceptionalism. The empire has never been so exposed. And it's shown Americans, who back in the imperial core continue to struggle to live decent, dignified lives, where all their tax money is going, and where it's definitely not. The US has been an empire since its very conception. From colonizing Native American land, to conquering territories overseas, to dominating world politics through global institutions, military might, corporate interests, and foreign meddling. Of all the empires that have risen and fallen, none have come close to having the reach and power of the US. So the idea of it losing its hold over the world seems inconceivable.
Yeah.
But while all these symptoms are unfolding and the US empire erodes from within and without, it's not doing so in a vacuum. It does so in the middle of a global shift in geopolitics, in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar, with countries choosing new allies, new frameworks for collaboration, even new currencies.
The aim of the alliance is to challenge the economic and political monopoly of the West.
All of which is not good for the US.
Yeah,
See, the way the global system is...
The danger here is a bully never goes down quietly in some sense, right? So everyone's playing their cards for an eventual downfall, which they all feel like they're seeing, or at least trying to prepare for something. And if it's a lot of, it's basically, it's the same like the meme where the US, China needs to do nothing and they win at this point. They're doing nothing and winning. Because the US is in such a chaotic state that you just have to let it be and it's going to destroy itself. We don't know what the future is, and I really hope that's not the case, but in some sense you need to be realistic and tell yourself, hey, we've had enough proof now that the US is just really in a downfall. And if you can fix monetary policy, if you can fix the debt of the United States, which is incredibly high, there might be a new chance to be found. But it's slim pickings at this point, I'll be honest. Again, I'm not trying to claim I'm knowledgeable about this, but this is what I'm seeing. And we can all judge from an average person. We got to look at the world and say, hey, what's going on? I live in the West, which is supposed to be one of the best places, at least for standard of living, and it just isn't getting better. So what do? We love our places. I love where I'm from. I love some of the cultures, the food, everything. But what the hell do I do if there's no future in the places I'm from, right? What do? That's the sad part, because I'd like to invest or to look forward to where I'm from. But I also got to think realistic, right? And I think a lot of people are having that sense of loss of hope. We don't, like, no one wants to have that. But this is so many years of disappointment.
Designed as, in many ways, for the benefit of America. From reliance on the dollar, US aid, and US debt, to fear of US sanctions, vetoes, and foreign intervention, we live in a world full of systems and institutions designed to prop up the US and keep the rest of the world in check.
Yeah.
But these systems aren't going to live forever because they're inherently unsustainable. They rely on the exploitation of peoples across the world and within the imperial core, and bank on them buying into the bit that all this is necessary, is better for them, and protects them. And as life becomes more unaffordable, countries more destabilized, governments more autocratic, and our environment more unlivable, people eventually wake up. And that's usually the beginning of the end.
That's an interesting perspective. That's usually the beginning of the end. Okay, this is How Empires Fall and Why the US is Next by Uncivilized. I think someone else, unfortunately I don't remember the name, but someone said that the US is going to fall, as an empire at least. And by falling, we don't mean everything's going to be leveled to the ground. That's not the point. But he said it doesn't really matter who you put in as president. At some point, it's just going to have to fall apart and find some form of rebirth. And that could take a long time. But he said that Trump is good at packaging it in a way that sounds like it's correct, whatever the next step is. That was just his thoughts, right? Let's see what people have to say. Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt. Give them fast food and streaming services, and they will never revolt. I don't know, man. Streaming services are expensive today. I think we're going to revolt on that basis. Yeah. The richest man in Rome, let's see what this guy has to say. Crassus owned the majority of real estate within the city of Rome. He amassed all the real estate because fires were very, very common in the city, and because there was no public fire department, you had a private fire department that would be dispatched to burning buildings and offer to put out the fire in exchange for ownership of the building. Okay, that's crazy. They would either give ownership of the building to Crassus or let it burn. That always seemed to have a uniquely American vibe to that. That's funny. Oh man. Remember, this is a closing statement right here. None of these empires thought they would ever fall, but one by one, they did. If you're in the US, what are you feeling? And if you're not in the US, what are you feeling? What do you think? Because I know people have different opinions all over the place, and many of them are unfounded, or, I want to hear what you think.